This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make it today with Squarespace.
How do we press this? How do we make it more exciting, more fun? How do we evolve the character and make it a rich story? And how do I make it interesting for myself to go do something else, you know? So yeah, I appreciate that too. I have fun with those movies, I really do, you know?
Aren't you that Spider-Man guy? I cannot emphasize enough how important the original Spider-Man trilogy was for comic book movies. Without the double whammy that was Spider-Man 1 and X-Men 1, all of these films may just not exist. Spider-Man took the world by storm and showed everybody that comic book movies were no longer box office poison. Every movie studio decided they needed to play catch up, but Spider-Man still went strong. Until, of course, we got arguably the most famous series ruiner of all time, Spider-Man 3. And even though it made the most out of almost any Spider-Man movie at about $900 million, it still ruined the series through its reception. But of course that's not all of it. There's way more to the behind-the-scenes story of Spider-Man 4 than just how Spider-Man 3 performed. But before we look into what Spider-Man 4 was going to look like, we need to understand what ruined Spider-Man 3. So as it's widely known, a big part that ruined Spider-Man 3 is total villain overload. And there's a simple behind-the-scenes explanation for this. Sam Raimi, who directed all three of the original trilogy, never wanted three villains. He wanted the Sandman to be the main villain, with Harry Osborn's side story finally being completed with his death. No Venom to be seen. Producer Avi Arad reportedly went to Sam Raimi and said that if he wanted fans to like Spider-Man 3, he had to raise the stakes and put in their favorite character, Venom. Raimi apparently didn't understand Venom that well and didn't want to put in a villain that he didn't understand himself, which is totally reasonable, but the studio kept pushing him, so they decided on a compromise. Let's just make both of us happy by adding Venom to the two villains that Sam Raimi already had in mind. Thus, Sandman, Venom, and Harry Osborn were planned. And, well, we know how that went. Okay, maybe I over-exaggerated that a little bit, but still Spider-Man 3 didn't go too well. Sam Raimi went on the Nerdist podcast not too long ago and explained how his misunderstanding of Venom and other characters led to the failure of Spider-Man 3.
I tried to make it work, but didn't really believe in all the characters, and so that can't be hidden from people who love Spider-Man. If the director doesn't love something, it's wrong of them to make it.
Later he came out and said that he really doesn't like Spider-Man 3. He thinks that he ruined it. He doesn't hide it one bit. Unlike many other filmmakers, he talks about his bad movies all the time. And if you don't believe me, listen to just a couple of minutes later on the Nerdist podcast when he talks about how he would describe Spider-Man 3 in one word.
Very few times do you hear filmmakers talking about their bad movies. I mean, people aren't interested in them.
But bad's not, I don't think bad's the right word. I think...
Awful.
No!
Learning from your mistakes is incredibly important, and he really believes that. You gotta give Raimi some credit. He takes the failure of Spider-Man 3 entirely on himself. He seems like he totally accepts it. Take notes, Josh Trank. But now that we know all about Spider-Man 3, let's get into the behind the scenes of Spider-Man 4. As we know, Raimi has said that he was incredibly disappointed in the third installment and that he wanted to make the fourth the best yet. There were rumors at the time that he wanted to do another trilogy all the way up to Spider-Man 6, but Raimi denies these. His plan that went along with Sony was that he would do everything he could to make Spider-Man 4 the best movie he's ever made, and then depending on the box office revenue, they'd either discuss Spider-Man 5 or just reboot everything with another actor. The farther they got into production, the more Sony was convinced that doing a reboot would just be better. Raimi continued to work though. He hired writer James Vanderbilt to write Spider-Man 4. His biggest credit at the time was Zodiac, which is pretty damn good, but it's not all good though. He ended up writing White House Down and Independence Day 2 Resurgence, so they're not all winners. Honestly, White House Down isn't that bad. This isn't even in the script, I just kinda like it. Raimi then got storyboard artist Jeffrey Henderson to make a mock-up of the script. Some of those Jeffrey has actually released. He hasn't released all of them, but we got enough to give us a good vision of what portions of the film would have looked like. Jeffrey also came out to say that Spider-Man 4, quote, would have been one absolutely kick-ass movie. Seriously, we were working on some crazy cool stuff, unquote. Later we'll look into the storyboards, but there's still more we need to know about the fourth installment. So of course, the full cast was set to return, Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, etc. It's unclear whether or not Bryce Dallas Howard would return as Gwen Stacy, but I would imagine so. She came out and gave a statement on it basically saying that she may or may not come back, she didn't know. But what would a Spider-Man movie be without some villains? So let's discuss that. Reportedly during Spider-Man 3, Raimi really wanted to do the Vulture with Ben Kingsley in the role. Sony wasn't really a fan, opting to do Venom instead. But now Raimi was no longer going to be convinced by his studio to do a character he himself didn't understand. Instead of Ben Kingsley eyed for the role like in Spider-Man 3, he opted for John Malkovich. But Raimi was not just happy with one villain in the movie, he had his eyes on Anne Hathaway as Felicia Harding, or as others know her, Black Cat. But even though she was Felicia Harding, she wasn't going to play Black Cat. She would have become the Vultress, basically the Vulture's partner. Which is super bizarre, just to take the Black Cat's name and make a whole nother character around that. But that's not it for villains. As you can see from the storyboard, a quite overweight Mysterio was meant to make an appearance at the beginning of the film. Mysterio was to be played by Bruce Campbell, which is actually pretty funny. If you don't know, Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell are great friends, and so Bruce has made an appearance in every Spider-Man movie so far. In Spider-Man 1, he played the announcer in the wrestling match that gave Spider-Man his name. In Spider-Man 2, he rejected Spidey from going into Mary Jane's play. And finally, in Spider-Man 3, he played the waiter that Peter used to help propose to Mary Jane.
Musicians would play this song.
Their favorite.
But just when you thought we were done with villains, let's get into the final villain and how that character may have been what ended Spider-Man 4. So far, Raimi had hired enough to get the project going, and everything seemed to be going okay, but reportedly, Raimi was getting tired out. He had almost been working on Spider-Man for 10 years straight, and with the pressure of such a beloved franchise, the weight was starting to wear. Reportedly, the studio desperately wanted to see Curt Connors as the Lizard on the big screen, and was trying to convince Raimi to do so. Raimi was getting sick of it. Interferences like this is why Spider-Man 3 didn't turn into what it needed to be. Allegedly, the studio just kept throwing the idea of a reboot at Raimi, saying that they should just stop production and get a whole new cast. Raimi seemed like he was just done. The script wasn't going how he wanted, and Sony had their mind on a reboot instead. And, well, I'll let Sam Raimi himself explain how it all ended. I was very unhappy with Spider-Man 3, and I wanted to make Spider-Man 4 to end on a very high note, the best Spider-Man of them all. But I couldn't get the script together in time, due to my own failings. And I said to Sony, I don't want to make a movie that is less than great, so I think we just shouldn't make this picture. Go ahead with your reboot, which you've been planning anyway. And Sony's co-chairman Amy Pascal said, thank you. Thank you for not wasting the studio's money, and I appreciate your candor. So we left on the best of terms, both of us trying to do the best thing for the fans, the good name of Spider-Man, and Sony Studios. It then turned out that James Vanderbilt, the man who Sam Raimi hired to write Spider-Man 4, had been hired by Sony to write a draft for the new Amazing Spider-Man. It's unclear whether or not Raimi knew that they had another script planned, or if they just did it behind his back. He has yet to comment on this. Immediately after Raimi canceled the project, Sony came to tell the public that a reboot was planned with all the new actors. And we know how that went. Sam Raimi seems like an incredibly respectful individual, but I can't help but imagine how frustrated he must have been. Sony has had a terrible track record of messing with their directors' visions, even so far as to basically ruin the film. And fighting that uphill battle for almost 10 years must have been exhausting. So now that we know what went wrong during the production of Spider-Man 4, let's get into what we know about the movie's story and what it would have looked like if it was actually made. So usually this segment in Cutshort is pretty lengthy since we have the full script to go off of, but this one's a little different. All we really have is rumors, some official statements, and storyboards. For such a big movie, all of the staff has done an incredibly good job of keeping everything under wraps. So don't be disappointed when you see that we only really know the beginning scene and one fight scene. So to start off the film, Raimi said it was going to begin with a montage of Spider-Man apprehending some C and D list villains that would never be main antagonists in his films. His examples were, quote, Mysterio, the Shocker, the Prowler, the old school onesie wearing version of the Rhino, and maybe even Stiltman. Whoa, someone tell Mr. Sunday Movies. So as Peter is feeling pretty great about catching all these criminals, the Vulture comes in. Raimi has come out and expressed his worry about the Vulture. He once stated that, quote, everyone was going to dismiss the Vulture as just an old guy in a silly green suit. So we wanted to go the opposite way and really make him the most fearsome and formidable adversary that Spider-Man had faced in the whole series, unquote. You can definitely see this translate to the storyboarding. Just like Homecoming, the Vulture has huge, threatening mechanical wings. As Peter fights the Vulture seems to be giving him quite the hard time, unlike the C-list villains at the beginning. Peter is trying to use the environment to defeat the Vulture, but eventually the Vulture shoots out what seems to be his razor feathers from his wings, severely hurting Spidey. Eventually, Anne Hathaway would have come in as the Vultress to help out against Spidey, but unfortunately that's all we know. I know, I wish I had more too, but like I said, Raimi really hasn't shared any details on the plot in any way. They may all still be under some non-disclosure contract. Now the storyboards I've gone over is not everything. There's still some left of random scenes like Mary Jane kissing Peter or the Vulture fighting a helicopter. I've linked the full storyboard below in the description if you want to see everything. Out of every single movie we've covered so far in this series, I think this takes the top spot of the film I'd most like to see. Sam Raimi has made some amazing stuff, and if Sony stayed back, I think he could really knock it out of the park. Tell me in the comments if you think Spider-Man 4 would have been good, or if you would have liked to have seen it. It's unfortunate that Raimi got burned out over it, but it's totally understandable. Right now, he's doing horror movie after horror movie, and apparently is having a blast. Smaller movies seem to be much more up his alley. Even though we never got to see Spider-Man 4, I'm glad everything worked out in the end. I'd also like to thank Squarespace for making this episode possible. You see Squarespace sponsor so many YouTubers, but it's for a good reason. Their product is actually really impressive. Whether you want to make an online store, portfolio, or blog, Squarespace gives you all the tools you need to make a beautiful website with no patches, upgrades, or installs required. All of their templates are super easy to use, and their award-winning customer service makes launching any website easier than it's ever been. Sign up today at squarespace.com/cutshort to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. It's companies like Squarespace or any other sponsor that is making smaller creators on this platform stay alive. So really, use the code squarespace.com/cutshort to help keep this channel going and show the sponsors that you really do appreciate what they do on this platform.
If this city was a kingdom, I'd want you to rule with me. Still worried for your safety after all that tomfoolery. And I know I'm probably freaking out foolishly. I just don't want the next thing that I write to be a eulogy in your honor. And I know you'd hate it too. All the petty little things that I'd associate with you, like stairwells.